All right, we just heard that Orwellian voice letting us know that we are being listened to and recorded. Welcome back, my friend.
Yeah, welcome, Guy, and welcome to the Overlord of Zoom.
Exactly. So I've been excited to continue this conversation. So we're going to, in some sense, pick up where we left off, right? Talking about this notion. It's an ancient notion, but John is, I think, bringing in a few things that he wants to, you could say, salvage and, in some sense, recreate and create newly around the notion of the Platonic forms, otherwise known as the eidos, and what he's calling eidetic deduction, eduction, right? And roughly speaking, eduction, to educe something, right? In some sense, it's to draw something out, so, right? To educe. So the eidetic deduction is some relationship with the eidos, right? In the way it's eidoseeing, educing, right? Itself in some way, right? And in the way that it does this in multiple levels, and specifically in dialogos, how it does that times 10, right? And it's a way of understanding that. And it's also a way, and this was really big for me because this is one of the things I think he talked about it. I think it was your video that he talked about this, but this was a big deal for me, is that to clear up some of the habits that we've gotten around talking about Plato, right? Where we usually, when we think of the word, the Platonic forms, right? That we usually think of, like, I know for me, a shape would come into mind, right? Like a shape of something, right? But form does not necessarily mean shape. And I think John's argument is specifically when it comes to Plato, he is not fundamentally getting at a entity or anything shape solid like, right? And so if you could just start from there as we're talking about this, that when you think about the eidos, or you think about the deeper eidetic form of something, if you notice that you think shape and then you suspend that for a moment, right? Something else starts to really show itself. And I think that showing, that something else, is what this conversation is really about, right? Yeah.
That was a good introduction.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you.
So I read a paper by Ivo De Gennaro, a German paper, as kind of preparation for this. Right, eidos is the look.
Yeah,
and
the look of something.
And in this paper, Ivo makes he makes the example of a doctor. Kind of you go to the doctor and you see a doctor at work. And then he says, kind of like, we all know what it's like to have a doctor around, caring for you, holding you in times of sickness. But yet, like, right, that when we then talk about it in more depth, then that whole thing, right, how does a doctor really has to behave? What are the features of a true doctor? It's almost right what Christopher said in the last conversation, right? He brought up that example, let's say, of a theater play. And you have all sorts of ways of behaving in a theater play, right? Just as a doctor, let's say, has multiple inexhaustible ways of behaving like a doctor. But that showing, kind of like, when we all know, oh, that is really a doctor, that is really, let's say, Hamlet, or that is really, let's say, a tea master, going back to these examples that we brought up in the last conversation.
Mm.
that comes, that's that grace. So Ivo calls it Gunst in German, which is something like benevolence or grace, which is always unhopeable. That's aletheia. That's the truth of something. And then we can just say it is so. For what that's Ivo's argument. You can just say, okay, it is so. But aletheia is like it's like it just appears, it just comes to us. That aletheatic showing, that other. And he would then, right, Ivo would then with Heidegger make the argument, right, the ones who are really called for responding with gratitude to that grace, that would be the poets, first and foremost. So, right, and maybe you can think of the idols as this, right, the look of something, right, the look of something just as it is in its truth. And I think that's right, that's what we are getting at, kind of like with the like then in eidetic deduction, this project of you and John.
And by the look of something, you mean, and Ivo's meaning, just like with a doctor, although a doctor does all these different things, and there's kind of an infinite amount of things a doctor can do as a doctor. However, there's that which you can, it comes together as you can identify his doctorhood, even though you can't reduce it down into some particular thing he does.
Yeah.
Right.
And that, right. And then there's with the revelation, let's say, of the suchness of doctor, then there's also right this light of aletheia, which shines light on all these things. And I think that's, in a sense, maybe that's the through line that we were talking about.
Right.
Me and John in our conversation.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because I wasn't expecting this as we were talking about this, but this last weekend we had did a weekend intensive part of a year-long circling training. So people that are coming in and training to learn how to lead in circles. And to do that is really like, it's really, to lead circles is really out of a way of being. It's a way of being with things in its most essential sense, right? However, to learn it, you have to break things down into these components, right? These practices and things that it's kind of wax on, wax off, right? Like in Karate Kid, you know? And there's this sense, and I haven't thought about this sense of going from becoming something that is an eidos, right? In some sense, you can see it, and for years now, and it is not a linear process at all. It seems like magic when you see it, where somebody goes from kind of stumbling around, not quite knowing what to do with their hands or what to say, or right. It's like when you first drive a car, you know, there's the stick, and then there's the clutch, and then there's the wheel, and they're three separate things. And then but at some point it all comes together. And just like this, you could see people go from trying to learn circling to the form circling happening. And it's like, and it's really strange because it's not like it's not like an addition problem, like 1 + 2 equals, right, equals 3. It's more like they practice these things and something catches. And you can see they're circling, right? You can feel it, you can experience it. It has the look of it. So that's the look of it. But it's interesting to kind of come from the angle of what is it to be, right? A particular eidos, or come to be an eidos, to behave, right? And to have that, our behavior be the look of the eidos.
And right, it's very strange that we all then kind of like we intuitively know what a doctor is like, what maybe what things are like in their suchness
Right.
when we experience it once. We know we know how these things should look like,
Right.
to invoke the look here. And that again, right? That's when just what you described, right? When you say, "Wow, that's circling," right? That would then be something maybe like aletheia.
Yep.
That light in which you then see
Yes.
the true look of circling.
Yes.
Let's say.
Right. And it's that and it gets into that part where you ask yourself, well, how like a moment ago wasn't circling and now it is. I get these questions as a teacher and I'm stumped by these questions, right? And I think that stumpedness in some sense exhibits the phenomena, because it's in some strange aspect, in some sense, if I try to describe that in terms of its aspects, to reduce it down to its aspects, right? That isn't very satisfying, because that's not what it is. It's that which gathers the aspects, right, into a coherent look of circling, right? But one of John's points in this, right, which is he keeps repeating, and it's one of those profound mind stumping things, which is, and that eidos, that through line, is not itself another aspect, right? It's something else, right? And that's the question I'm really left with. What is that something else? And and that starts to lead to, it's interesting. We're on one level, we could say we're talking about these kind of very esoteric kinds of things, but no, this is, if you can identify things, the look of things, like a doctor, right? Like a house, a person. These are all things that you can just look out and somehow grasp them, like in a very ordinary way. What we're talking about is that sense, is the basic way the world is intelligible, and what is it about the world that allows it, that it affords it its intelligibility, right? But in the most ordinary way sense, right? But when we start to ask these questions about, well, if it's not another aspect, well, what is it? Well, like in your conversation with John, you end up talking about God, which is really interesting.
Yeah. But right, I mean, we could just, right, we could just talk, maybe this is maybe also from my reading of Ivo de Gennaro, where we could talk about it in a phenomenological way. Let's say you have this experience, okay, now it's circling, now this practice here that we are doing is confirming to the eidos of circling.
Yeah.
Okay. Or let's say the music piece that I'm just listening, the musical performance that I'm just listening to is confirming to the eidos of that particular music piece, right? And maybe phenomenologically speaking, then we could think about, okay, well, what other things are now flagrant for us? What's coming? What else is going on beyond that? And then, right, we could maybe say, oh, maybe I'm also right. We're coming into right relationship with time and being. That's right. Time and being are somehow connected. maybe they are reciprocally the same also.
Right.
Right. Or maybe, right, we have also something like wonder, right? Then when this happens suddenly, when this confirmation happens, we have wonder, we have something like truth lightening up, where we also find deep peace with ourselves. So
Mhm.
this kind of this sufficiency that
Mhm.
when not right, and we can talk about this, right? And this mistake of modernity that we think that all these things are resting in themselves in perfect self-identity and self-sufficiency, and not in any relationship to anything else. So, right,
Yeah.
that's really the atomistic view of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that right, that smartphone is like it's on. There's no right that we are just wills bumping against each other. That's kind of like the modern outlook. Atoms clashing onto each other.
Mhm.
Again, right, then if you're, I don't know, we talked about this, if you're a parent and you're holding your child,
Mhm.
that idea becomes quite absurd.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
Yeah.
And things are much more interdependent
Yeah.
and incessantly, reciprocally, mutually connected with and to each
Yeah.
other
And
than
that
we.
totally. Yeah.
So and then right then with that, then we might also right ask the same things that Plato asked. Okay, the truth of things is now flagrant, but then again, and that's maybe also for dialogos important, what are maybe the virtues to cultivate this, right?
Mm.
And that's also one thing, right, that with agape or love or compassion
Yeah.
and logos, where they come together in dialogos. And I think that's
Yeah.
very important,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because
Absolutely.
you need them both to I think of this religiously in this more kind of like Neoplatonic sense.
Yeah.
I'm as is Christian Neoplatonism, right? That Nishitani is similar. He also you can't just talk about intelligibility without love, without compassion,
Right.
without agape. It's my
Right.
opinion.
So it's almost, yes, it's
You
almost like
find it.
like lo- love presupposes the question of truth, right? Like it presupposes the question that draws forward truth or intelligibility presupposes a kind of love, right? Yeah.
That's I would say, if the truth of something shows up, I would say something like love, or maybe as Ivo says, right, with the poet's gratitude for that grace.
Yeah.
I think that's the only appropriate comportment.
Yeah.
If it's only the only way to hold open that moreness.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, you have to love your child in order to see its flourishing into the moreness.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's we have to do that, like
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And in some sense, this is what in the Neoplatonic Christian tradition, Christianity brought into these Greek ideas, right? Is this sense of, specifically the agapic love, right? As John talks about in his series so profoundly, this way that in some sense you could say I was part of the Christian being able to kind of take over all of Rome in some way is through this idea of agapic love making persons, right?
yeah
Whereas, before that in Rome, maybe the persons were the aristocracies or whatever, the leaders, but there were all these levels of people who were slaves who weren't quite people. And then, Jesus comes along, and then the whole Christian tradition comes on board, and has this gaze of agapic love that starts making people. All of a sudden, peoplehood, right, is afforded through this. And in some sense, you can imagine that was part of how how it came into existence, you know, it birthed a certain kind of history, remarkably, or at least was a big part of it. Yeah.
Mm.
And there's that sense, which I think I was just talking about this beforehand. I'm in the middle of writing a post, like a blog article about this kind of insight I'm getting through having my second child, Teague, who's going on 3 months, of just seeing so profoundly this way in which there is no Teague. There's simply Teague being held, right? And if he, you know, if we just at this state, if we let go of that holding, it would take probably not much more than a day before he would just start to disintegrate into his environment, right? Right. And
Mm.
there's a particular human, and here's the part about this, and this is particularly human in the sense that we start the most vulnerable than any other mammal that we know about in the whole world, right? Because human infants are just pathetically dependent. They're almost nothing, right? They can't do anything for themselves. And so in some sense, family parenting is enacting a kind of womb, right? In which it's amazing that we figured out how to do that. But there's something about that utter dependent helplessness and that vulnerability that when it's held in agapic love, you can start to realize that there's something that somehow it transforms that vulnerability into, well, look who's on top of the food chain. Look who's going to Mars. Look who's thinking about the cosmos, right? There's this deep connection between this vulnerability and what it affords, right? The kind of transcendence that it affords, right? In a certain sense. And but when agapic love is dwelt in properly, right? When it's not there, all that goes away. All that vulnerability becomes a diminishment, right? In some sense. So, but what's interesting about this is that in modern time, right? I think we do definitely have the sense in which, yeah, like we could all understand that the child is, we're as parents, we're holding the child, right? And to the degree that we hold him well is to the degree that he will transform into being able to hold himself, right? And as he holds himself, we can hopefully let go, right? As he holds himself. But it's not so obvious, in at least in a felt way, to what degree that while we are parenting, how we are in turn beholden, right? Like in a, like we're not just sole proprietorships, right? Kind of holding our child, holding ourselves, right? No, we have a house. The house holds us, right? We live in a neighborhood, in a town that pipes in water, right? And has roads that supply food, and we have friends, and then we have this whole historical social custom that has like passed down century upon century, right? That we're embodying, that's holding us, right? And I think, and for some reason, and I think that we can maybe talk about this, but that sense of, we definitely have this sense of being an adult, growing up, is we pick ourselves up by the bootstraps, right? We hold our life, we grasp our life, we hold ourselves, right? We think about the sense of that we're holding our world and our life. We even talk about it like that. But very little attention in a felt way reveals the sense in which we are simultaneously beheld, right? We are beholden as we behold. And I think all of those examples substantiates kind of like they're all examples of a deeper pattern, right, of being itself, right? There's this way that being itself has both this deep beholding of itself, right, and beholden of itself, which manifests as all these particular things that we can start to enact. But that relationship, I would say, to this sense in which we are profoundly held, right, is virtually invisible to us. And maybe we could say that shows itself in, like, you know, the environmental issues and in the way that we've unintendedly created things, built things that don't notice the holding that affords us building those things, nor paying attention to those. Like, that's starting to play out big time in the environment and those kinds of things, right?
Yeah. And I would maybe also say that, right, we also forget that it's something like death. we forget it, and I will say why. So I will take the notion from the later Heidegger, right? There's the fourfold, and there's earth and sky and mortals and divinities, and they are. He says this in a little bit strange way, but they are, I would say, putting it simply, they are holding each other in their fourfoldness. Those regions of intelligibility hold each other. So when I, let's say, I go and take a stroll through the fields where I live, then I'm very aware that it's not just me holding myself in this, again, this self-sufficient, isolated, atomistic way, but I'm aware that, okay, the ground that I'm standing on and the firmament above me, those things are holding me.
Yes.
And I'm right. The task of the human being is to recognize this and to be mindful of it.
Yeah.
And not to, right, not to, this is kind of like what the Buddhists always say, right? This trap of the human being to collapse into yourself and to forget about all of this. And then kind of like just fall prey to your own delusions. That's the right. That's the great danger that comes with our creatureliness as human beings.
Right.
And right, that's, I mean, you said it in your words, and that's right. It's this, that we, by beholding something or the world or things are beholding us.
Yeah.
And I mean, what you said is like when you kind of like the way, right, you explained it, right? There's the household, then there's maybe the neighborhood, there's a city, there's a state or whatever. Right? That's kind of like similar to what Jonathan Pashurza says, right? There are all these patterns in the world, and they are all real, and they're really real and holding us. And we can't collapse it just down to something like, I don't know, then maybe just the soul is real and or the mind is real or so. But they're real. They're much larger patterns which we are responding to.
And so in some sense, the educing, right, even right now in this conversation, in some sense we can feel us educing this eidos that not only affords us to see more of what's there and create more, but I would say in this time, the big thing is it affords us to see our indebtedness to it, right? Like this quality, this way in which we don't notice, right, in a felt way, this way in which we are deeply held, right?
Yeah. And right,
Which then of course makes our beholding of everything else from a basis of no awareness of like the hand without any awareness of the arm, right, is going to act really strange, right? It's going to show up in the way that the hand is the hand, right? It'll build things that don't account for the rest of the body, and then we'll end up, with all these environmental catastrophes, right? In some sense, right?
Right. That we couldn't say that has to do maybe with the oblivion of being. We don't, right? We talked about this before we started the conversation. Like, we don't. That's kind of like we don't know what the look of things is any longer. If I don't, right? If I don't know what the look is of, let's say, winter, then how can I realize when suddenly there are no winters anymore?
Right.
If let's say, I don't know, that's always this when reality changes, and suddenly, I don't know, talk with someone else about this, kind of like relationships have changed so much in the last 10 to 20 years. No one takes like we just text each other, and like people struggle with intimacy in ways that all of that, right? And then so when the look of things is not visible any longer, when the truth of things just as they are in their suchness is not realized and felt any longer, then we can't, right? Then we also can't have a real relationship with reality. And then we really just live in the world of shadows, and
Totally.
and that there's the great danger, right? This is then being is withdrawing, being is forgotten, and then things turn into not so catastrophe.
Well, well, you could say that in some sense it'll stop holding us, right? And at least at least in whatever it is that holds us in such a way that arises a human being, that one can have the look of a human being, right?
I mean, that's also right. And that's what we call the meaning crisis. If that look, that truth doesn't show up any longer, then we are in a meaning crisis. And then, right, then we, that's also what we then need to do. Then this necessity of, let's say, eidetic deduction or dialogos practices, coming into right relationship, maybe also with the philosophers of the past. That, again, that then all becomes a very deep necessity. So that we really know the look of things.
Right. And this is in some sense, I think, one of the things, I mean, I'm wondering about this because we talked about this last time. Heidegger, who both of us have, a lot of familiarity with, if it's possible to be familiar with Heidegger, right? In some sense, he, roughly speaking, talks about the beginning of the end was essentially with Plato, right? And so you can talk, in some sense, this kind of sense where being and beings, right, start to break apart, and there's this difference and all this kind of stuff that is then becomes metaphysics, that affords the ability to forget, right, that which holds all of it, being, right, in which he's trying to reawaken. But what I'm finding, though, is that what we're doing right now is we're actually going back to Plato, but in some sense through the education of Heidegger, and seeing these Platonic ideas through a Heideggerian sensibility. And something else is emerging. We don't see Plato here as the enemy, but I'm starting to see Plato as another beginning. And this is one of the things about Heidegger talks about a lot. And this is always, when I first heard this language, it sounded so esoteric to me, but I think actually part of what we're doing here in this little corner of the internet, and what's drawing or gathering us to have these conversations, right, that seem on some level so kind of strange, right, to most people.
No. No.
But in some sense, Heidegger talks about another beginning, right? This notion of another beginning. The first beginning being with the pre-Socratics, right? Closely related to Plato. And Heidegger goes back, and he, a big part of his work is going back into the origin, in some sense, of philosophy, and seeing through all of the layers of history and trying to get a sense of the original opening, right, from the Greek sense, and the atmosphere around that was awakened. And at some point, right, you could say that somewhere in that atmosphere, it condenses and consolidates into a particular view or a sense in which then unfolds. And in some sense, I think one of the things that Heidegger is trying to do in his notion of history, the history of metaphysics, is to feel back to that beginning, into the atmosphere from it, and see it in its Greek sense, and begin again, the other beginning, right? In some sense, to begin from it again. And I'm getting I feel like I'm in that trajectory, in some sense, in these conversations of going back and looking at these very old, some would say, like dead terms, right? Outlived terms, and finding something generating from them, right? And it's just interesting to me that, like, you know, Heidegger really kind of had such a mixed relationship with Plato, such a critical relationship with Plato. However, through Heidegger, in some sense, affords us to be able to even look at Plato and see him newly, right, in the way that we're talking about it. So I just want to, I feel indebted to that sensibility and part of what's going on here as well. Would you agree with that?
I think the notion of the other beginning is in so far important, right, as we are in a very different situation than the Greeks have been, right? We are really, right, right, because that wonder is just not there anymore, and people also don't realize it. So then again, those, you can only listen to John's Meaning Crisis series if you really think there is a meaning crisis. If you don't feel and experience that shock that there's no meaning, then why would you listen to something like that, right? Oh, I have Netflix and I busy myself. So, right, the first thing is, right, that's very existential. Yet you have to feel that shock of that. And that's also, right, that's also then why it's a different beginning, because we are in this, after Nietzsche, we're really in this period of shock, that meaning is and sense is just staying, these things are just staying away. While even for the Greeks, there was just, right, that moreness shining through, that's a wonder, right? And for us, it's like we don't even realize that it's not there. It's right, as Nietzsche says in that Death of God aphorism, right? This event is still on the way.
Yeah.
It's like he runs, right? His madman runs around through the marketplace and screams at the, look what's going on, and nobody sees it. And I often, right, it's like few people, of course, see it, but most of the people don't pay attention to it, don't don't realize it.
Yeah.
So that's, I think that's one main, right, main difference, that we're in very, very different situation.
Yeah.
And right, we have to find our own way of talking about these things.
Yeah.
And maybe we can, and we can console, right, the ancients, but we have to do it differently necessarily, just because we are such in a different place.
Right.
Also, right, with technology, with progress, with science and these things. And yeah, I'm not sure if I wanna say that Plato is the first nihilist. I don't even know if I want to dispense with metaphysics in a sense, because I brought this up in the conversation I had with John, which we might see then now.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That there's this trajectory coming from Plato, Neoplatonism, let's say Meister Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, and that then coming also through partly through the Orthodox tradition, and now people like John are really interested in Neoplatonism, epiphatic theology, and these things. Heidegger is also very influenced by Eckhart, for example. The Kyoto School is very influenced by those traditions. So maybe we can revive, right? We can carry it on.
Yeah.
Then we wouldn't have to say that Plato is the first nihilist, but kind of like, right, it's just the inception of the tradition. Maybe it can go on.
Yeah.
Maybe we can continue it, that
Right.
metaphysical tradition, and do not have to dispense with it.
Right.
But I don't know that.
Yeah.
I also take kind of like the other side seriously, where, right, Heidegger proclaimed the end of philosophy.
Totally. It seems if we did, right, if we could, and if we did, it seems that what I think I find ourselves pulled to do is, there's the Platonic forms and then Plotinus and all the Neoplatonists, which are these kind of systematic, almost, right, treatises of metaphysics, right? It seems that what I sense that we're doing is tuning into that and making sense of the world, right? Making sense of, and in some sense, bringing it into the not the split, Platonic heaven and then the fallen world or something, but like, no, in our fallenness as an organization, from within it, that these principles and these ideas have an eidos that we can be in touch with, that isn't somewhere else, but it's right in the very center and source of the world, right? I think my sense is like, that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and right, that's kind of like with the example of the doctor, of the theater play, of the musical performance, of the tea ceremony.
Yes.
Right, then this sudden shining forth of that truth, right? It's so immediate and so direct and so also, right, it touches us in the depths of our being,
right,
when that happens,
right, right.
So and right, and then that identity deduction, right, then that makes makes a lot of sense, right?
Makes a lot of sense.
We're going to something that is closer than, it's very close, it's over close, it's very near.
So near,
it's not
so near, we could almost miss
away.
it, right?
It's not far away.
Yeah.
It's so near that, right, that it's fleeting.
Totally. Pause 1 second. My little machine vacuum started on its own. Let me go shut it off. Hang on. So just how about we I'll pull up the video. I'll go ahead and I pulled it back a minute from where we left off. So I'll just press play, and then we can just let me know when you want to pause, and I'll pause, and we can see what we can deduce. One, two, three.
Non-being, the nihilum, or emptiness or so.
Yep.
So the aspects emerge. And kind of like, so you say there's this, all the aspects, all let's say the characteristics of the whatness of an object, of myself, form a non-logical identity that isn't in itself higher, that is also kind of like a no thing. There's not an aspect in itself,
yes,
but
exactly.
some not even something, nothing else, something.
Yes.
And I think, right, we could maybe say this is now maybe the Geist or something like that.
Yes.
It's a kind of like it's a third kind. Maybe we can use that language. Even this is a.
So just for our listeners, the third kind, maybe the third kind that it may be that we're talking about. What are the first two kinds? It's the aspect and the eidos, or the aspects and the through line. Do you remember what the third kind? What were the other two?
Emergence and emanation.
Okay, emergence and emanation, right? And emergence. So emergence, I think about is kind of from below, and emanation is like the light from above, right? Yeah. Okay. So
there is, right, so things are emerging, things are forming, right? Things are gathering something, but they are not just gathering randomly, but they are constrained in a certain way. Right, the human being is not just exploding like a whoosh when it's forming, but it's forming into a particular shape. In particular, right? We all know what like a human being should look like. And in that, the problem is, right, that there needs to be a third kind, something that informs the intelligibility of both those things.
Yes, that's what you're getting at. Is that this third kind?
There's this. Let's say John White always describes this like this. There's emanation from above. There's emergence from below. But we need a kind of arena, a field, or again that there must be something in the middle that mediates those two.
What are those? And the third thing would be something like asking the question, what are the constraints that afford those two things coming together in their moreness and suchness? What holds all that together?
Something like that.
Okay. Right.
Insight from Nishida, who was very also interested in kind of like in Plato. He thought that there is, right, there's being and non-being, and they always oscillate between each other in the hora, which was then this kind of like the centerpiece in Nishida's ontology, this receptacle, the place,
the chora,
kind of like in what Plato calls it triton genos, a third kind, something ontologically different from all the other things. And I sometimes think this comes to your relevance realization in any kind of, anyways. So
no, that's directly right. I think let's come back to that, because the process of relevance realization, I think, I don't want to say it's reflected, because I'm not trying to speak like a form of Berkeleyan idealism, but there's a mirroring of the way relevance realization is unfolding in a way in which eidetic eduction is disclosing. Yes, I think that's important, but please continue.
Okay, and then JP talks then about there's also the constraint, the one emanates down.
Yes.
And that then kind of like I would say constitutes what the Buddhists call first the suchness, although maybe, and then
I tend to think of the moreness and the suchness as directional, and Heraclitus is the way up and the way down are the same way. I think of the way this comes in. So let's use the language of determination the way Pearl does. When you get the determination that gives you a determinate singularity, right, that can't be cannot be captured categorically. That's the suchness. But when you see that suchness, right, in terms of how it, right, proceeds, my language is failing me, into, right, this combinatorial explosiveness of all the possible intelligibilities it can participate in, that's what I think of as the moreness. Did that help, or
let's pause here maybe.
Right, there's
Yep.
What did you take from that? What myself and John just shared?
So a few things. There's this mystery that we can identify something as something, right?
Yeah.
That is what it is, not based on categories, right? It goes beyond its categories, yet it's still something, right? So like for you, I would imagine a person is like that, right? Like there are certain things that I can categorize about you, like you have a body, right? You're from a certain place, right? You speak a certain language. These are kind of categorical things. But yet the particular way that you gather together will continually, if I'm really being with you and open to you, you'll continually outlive those categories or do things that are surprising to me, or go beyond my ability to conceptualize you in some fixed way, right? And so that's, I think, what you guys are starting to deuce out here.
Yeah, just right. That quote from Heraclitus, the way up and the way down are the same way. That also rings differently, you know,
Yeah.
with the notion of the same, right? That we are always responding to the same. That's always, it's always already there and gathering and skinning at the same time.
Yes. Well, even right there, that notion that you've heard before, with all these other things that we've been talking about, rings differently. There's the moreness, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's like on one level, but it's still the Heraclitean statement that it is. It's constrained, yet it rings differently, right? So it's more than in the way that it's constrained, simultaneously goes beyond itself, but reveals the very sentence even more by going somehow beyond itself, right? I think that's probably an example right there in that new ringing, or ringing differently.
And it's still right that's a wonder of it. It's still true. It's still it. Right, and that's the wonder of it, right? What you just said before. You can point to let's say a person, but at the same time that person is unanalyzable in its suchness and kind of like transcending into moreness. Then we could say, right, and then we could say, oh no, I can't actually, right, I can't point to anything, maybe. As we can say, okay, that's Guy, that's Daniel, that's John, that's a glass of water, that's a doctor, that's a tea master, whatever. So that is this ultimate, right, this statement of intelligibility that we can make it is also right.
Well, I can't, is it fair to say I can't reduce it? However, I think what we're talking about is that I can't reduce it to some aspect of you, because it goes beyond that. However, I think what we're saying is that we can somehow educe it. We can draw it out into intelligibility, right? We can draw out that new ring, right? We can somehow educe it, right?
Yeah, and right, and the third kind, maybe talking about just what we are doing now, that we are really drawing out and dancing with the structures of intelligibility that we have, that's informed by this no thing that we can't see. So we are participating in a field, in an arena, in a Geist. This was kind of what I was talking about.
Yeah.
That informs that whole that process.
Yeah.
Just right now.
Yeah.
As well.
Totally.
But right, it's we can't see it. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not that informing of intelligibility. It's not just in my speech. It's not just in your speech.
Yes.
It's something that is right. It's something else.
Yes. It's that way that like a mirror, right, in some sense, reflects everything but itself, right? In fact, the mirror is that which is not reflected, right? But reflects everything else. And so in some sense, this is kind of what I think why psychedelics are so important to people right now, right? Well, probably forever, but is in some sense, it jiggles the mirror. And they're like, whoa, that third thing just moved. It's different. I didn't even notice that there was a third thing because it worked so well, right? And until it kind of somehow jiggled, we weren't aware of it. We're just caught in the world of what it reflected and dealing with all of that. And then we kind of like, I don't know, take the substance or meditate or something like that. And then the mirror goes, brrr, and we're like, oh, hey, something that was different than everything else. What is that difference? Yeah.
And right then, so we draw each other out. We come into conformity with each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's it. I look at you, you look at me. We see each other's looks, let's say. And what then is then the more that first kind of could also say maybe the idea of the good then also for Plato is so important.
Yeah.
That kind of like that in which all the forms are participating.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, but John then brings up later that, right, with Gregory of Nyssa, the eternal God as the field of the eternal field of intelligibility. That was kind of like what I was getting at.
Yeah.
And I was even feeling it, that presence. There is, there's in the Meister Eckhart, there's a quote that's something like, someone says something like, I can't describe God to you or so, or don't know what God looks like. But I sometimes hear him, what's that when you're swallowing something? So I sometimes hear him just doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like almost you overhear him, like the echo. Yes, you overhear God, right? Like there's a poem I wrote where it says like, is that you, God? Is that you, God, sitting just behind my eyes as I look for you walking in circles, right? Yeah, it's here's we start to get to what we were addressing earlier. It's somehow what we're addressing here is closer to us than ourselves. And in its very nearness, it's paradoxically what makes it most difficult to unconceal, right?
I mean, right, that's a very famous, right? Saint Augustine also talked about God as that which is the most, right?
Yeah.
Interior intimo meo, in my innermost interior, like there's God, more inner than I am inner to myself, so to say.
And this is part of what I think I've noticed when people talk about like encircling, right? I've heard people for years on their own, right? Like describe this experience of being seen, right? And in some sense, I think what we're talking about is what distinguishes being deeply seen versus a narcissistic reification or reflection, right? To be seen is precisely to have the experience of in conversation with you, of somehow listening to you in such a way that you get that I see that thing that's closer to you than yourself. And so what gets reflected back to you or beheld, right, is that thing that you could sometimes overhear, that's prior to everything, that's way back here. It's like that third thing. And people have this experience of where, in some sense, you paraphrase the thing that you could never say, but you realize it's all you've ever been, right? And somebody says it back to you and holds it up, and you're like, finally, right? There's this kind of existential relief in some sense, right?
And who was, now we get really into God and things. who was best at drawing out that we could say maybe is Jesus.
Yeah, and Socrates too.
Socrates, right? Those right, because they could, I mean, right, when you think about, I don't know, a peasant, like a fallen creature, I don't know, someone who's addicted, who lives on the street, who baths in his own excrements. Then those people for let's say Roman society, so those were just the non-persons.
I often call those people Guy Singsta. Even at some of my best moments. Yes, go on.
Right, and then right, Jesus comes along, and can those fallen creatures can educe the spark of divinity in their soul and remind them of that, and draw it out, and is capable, right, of loving them despite them being fallen. I mean, we right, so, and that making of personhood, that realizing that this field of intelligibility is, let's say, it's not just for the aristocracy. It's not just shared by them, but it extends to all, to everything.
The through line.
That's
and in this sense, right, here's the eduction part, right? In some sense, Jesus came along, right, and educed, in some sense, through a kind of agapic love. Right.
That's important.
Listened them, was moved by them in such a way that it educed this through line that went through everybody, right, as themselves, right? That's the thing I think it's so important about. I've often thought about this, that I think that perhaps the deepest way that you could love someone is to cultivate the kind of openness and listening of them such that you are able to be moved by whatever it is most essential in them. The ability to be moved by someone is perhaps, we usually think about being moved as something I'm experiencing, but I think when it comes to persons, being moved by another is revelatory of that person that you're moved by. And that sense is like, I mean, there's very little of that going on, I think, in anywhere, right? You talked about it in, the sense of your description of being in the tea ceremony, where you talked about, this woman coming in and feeling accepted for the first time, right? In some sense, like
being seen,
Yes,
that
being
same
seen.
that same thing that you were describing.
Yeah.
And I would then see, right, it's not then just then we have a conformity, let's say, with things, with other persons, but essentially also that we have a participation in that field of love,
Yeah.
where God can inexhaustibly disclose himself or so,
Totally.
and provide us with that ever gifting intelligibility or so.
Yeah. It's funny. I can feel a sense of it right now. So that third thing, right? In some ways, I feel as if we're attempting to bring language to something that's actually present. Like I can overhear it. I can feel the echo of it. I can feel the presence of the thing that we are trying to educe, right?
I mean, it's right. Maybe bringing up an obvious example, right? When people have, let's say, there's a deep encounter. Let's say, John, sometimes when we have these deep encounters, we often use sexual images or sexual metaphors. Even then, right, there was always in our this human history, the last 2000 years or so, we always had an awareness. Okay, that participation is not just between them, but is also surrounded and enveloped by that field of God. And right, that's why we do even marriage in a church and make say it, so to say, before God, because that is the third, right? God is that field that surrounds them.
So here, I really just got that sense of like this third thing, this field, right? This sense of holding ourselves up and grasping our lives and picking ourselves up and being an individual, that what we're talking about is the thing that's probably the most concealed in modern life, is this very thing that's anonymously, right, unrecognizably holding us, right? This is that which is beholden of us and affords our ability to behold the world in our lives. Yet, but because we don't see the delicate relations that afford this, that make this up, we can't respond to them. Therefore, our beholding mirrors our misunderstanding, or it mirrors the lack of our sense of being held. And this, whatever it is that holds all this, seems to be open enough to allow, right, to afford a weaving of a life, of a holding that mirrors our fundamental relationship with this thing that we're having a hard time describing, right, in some sense. So it still is present, but it's present in how we weave the world into a pattern that doesn't account for, in some sense, the invisible weaver, right?
Definitely. And
Really
then, right, then again, then just look at modern relationships. I mean, either, right, you have the idea, I don't know, it's merely subjective, everything's subjective.
Yeah.
My feelings are subjective. Love is just a subjective feeling, but not right. Real love is in a sense then also informed by a field that kind of like makes love in the first place. I would say. And then then what happens is then the world just becomes more brutal and more raw and more colder.
Transactional.
We treat it like the world becomes then kind of like the playground of instrumental rationality, or the will to power, or the will to will, or these things. And then we treat each other more and more standing reserve.
Yeah. I think what we're addressing is addressing that which affords us to be able to address and be addressed by that which we would address for its own sake. Right? That's what we're talking about, is this kind of restoration, a renewed attention that can attend to that which, as Nishitani said in his definition of religion, as a real, what is it? A real
self-realization.
A real self-realization of reality for its own sake. And that last part, for its own sake, right, is that which is rapidly going away. Very few, even people notice that they don't relate to things as an end in itself, but as a continuous means, right?
Yeah, I mean, Nishitani in the last part of the book, so in the last section of the last chapter, he kind of talks about this as well. The Kantian standpoint. Yeah. The Kantian standpoint was to anthropocentric, and especially right when we then talk about things that we mostly make a means of them, right? And that, I mean, that's really when you take the idea of the standing reserve, right? And I mean, when you look around and see how things are all conforming just to us, and we can't let them be, right? This releasement idea, we can't let them be for their own sake, for their own suchness. I mean, that's, again, people don't see it, right? In the beginning of, I think in the first page of Ivo de Gennaro's Weirdness of Being, he says, we don't know what it means that we think in the enclosure of subjectivity. This enclosure, this entrapment in subjectivity has become so native to us that we're like in the cave. We don't see that those things are actually withdrawing. Most people don't see that they are withholding sense, that they are we are exhausting them. We don't see it. Some people see it, but most people just live in that. I mean, and Heidegger has a reason for that, because we're just absorbed by being in the world. We just think that whatever is going on is that's just the way things are.
Yeah.
And that's why, right, Plato makes this distinction, right? We are all like prisoners in a cave.
Yeah.
We all think in our daily life in that's just how things are.
Yeah.
But not that's how things really are.
Yeah.
How reality really is, how things really are for their own sake, that is not quite the same as this ordinary way of being.
Yeah, I'm so present to just a sense as we're talking about this, that visceral sense, and you could say the comportment of reverence, right? To revere, right? That sense of it when you're talking about this. All right, so you want to let's play some more.
Let's do this.
Oops. Share the screen again.
there is in all of that, and that's, I think there's this wonder as well that we
Yeah.
have an identity.
Yes,
What you would say the non-logical identity.
very much. Yes.
That's kind of like that's a wonderful thing that we have that, and right there is even in Nishitani, like identity becomes so important in this what he used.
Real quickly, can you for our listeners, can you describe what is a non-logical identity versus a logical identity? What's that distinction?
Does John go into it? I'm not sure.
Okay.
Will he talk about this in this time? I don't
Yeah.
think so, right? So oh, that's long.
I think I can probably summarize it real quick. My understanding of it is,
okay.
a logical identity is where you can, it's really clearly A equals A, right? You can,
Yeah.
right? It's has to do with kind of this weird kind of sameness, right? Whereas non-logical identity is, it's that thing that allows you to be able to look at photos from when you were 2 and say, that's me, right? That person doesn't look anything like you, right? But somehow you can look at it and say, that's me. That's a non-logical identity. It's in other words, it's not A equals A. It's A is more than A, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in the Kyoto school, right? There's this. So you have in our philosophy, right? There are, from, let's say, from a logical perspective, right? Some people are were very strong on the principle of non-contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
A is A. There's
Yeah.
a real
non-contradiction. Yes.
And then but and there, right, there is modern schools in philosophy, dialephism, for example. They embrace that there are true contradictions. Some would say that's also true for Hegel, for example. Nishida and Nishitani definitely fall into that. So they step out of the Aristotelian framework and make and affirm the contradictory nature of the world. So right, we're not just in self-sufficiency, let's say, with ourselves, but there are also those infinite contradictories and contraries that also belong to our identity.
Yes.
And that's kind of like captured in this. This is not fire, therefore it is fire.
Yes.
So there is this. So that means that right. Some people who sometimes identity is also described as a container, right? Because your identity contains you, so to say.
Yes.
I mean, and today we don't just have those pop culture wars. Things with identity, where we are fixated on like those boundaries, what we are, anyways. But a non-logical identity is then someone, okay, there are other things that belong to myself that are clearly alogically related to me, like, let's say, maybe my past self. That's the example that John brought up, right? Maybe also other things in the world, like you or the computer, because right that or even right then things like God also. So and that kind of like is then a higher, this is a higher identity. And a higher identity is also that all of the parts, all of the emergent parts form a coherent whole. Right, this is this thing from Gestalt psychology, right?
Yes.
That the Gestalt is the whole look is more than all the parts of myself.
Yeah, like somehow I am a millions of cells.
Yeah.
Right. The
but
Gestalt is Guy. That if I try to look for Guy, in terms of the millions of cells,
You won't
right,
find it.
I won't
Yeah.
find it, right? That's the,
And
so
that-
that's like
that-
the non-logical identity. Yes.
That's kind of that. So that example that you just brought up, that was what I was referring to.
Okay, got you. Okay, good. I hope that's clear for people. All right, here we go.
Also the Sieve.
Yes,
the Sieve is just this. Indicates that self-identity or self-sameness, let's say, between.
Now this is from Shita, right? This thing that you're talking about here, this is not from Nishitani, this is from Nishida, right?
No.
Oh, okay.
The Soku, that's the Sive is, right, it comes up, for example, in Spinoza,
Okay.
who says God is nature, Deus sive natura.
Okay.
And kind of like the Sive is that which constitutes the self-identity, the non-logical identity of two things.
Yeah.
Let's say me and my past self.
Yeah.
Or all of your parts.
Yeah.
All of your cells and Guy.
Yeah.
But it's that third kind of point that binds those two, but this is neither of those two.
Yes. Okay, got it.
The Soko is actually it's that middle thing between form and emptiness.
Totally.
And form.
It's like translogical. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also the Soko is also very strange. What we will talk about.
We'll go into that. Yes. Okay. Here we go.
Form and emptiness.
Yes.
But he uses it for all kinds of being and no thingness and let's say that the one and the no thingness, or the one and the many. And but right, he points at that again, the Sive is in a sense it's a third kind. It's
yes. And I think the third kind has also been discovered convergently, but also a little bit off by people like Derrida, because I think what Derrida was doing with difference was trying to pick up on this as well. And he was, I see Derrida at times overemphasizing, although towards the end, he gets very interested in negative theology, right? And he's like, well, not towards the end, he keeps doing it, that becomes more prominent, right? Because I think he overemphasized, I don't know, what you might call the privative or destructive aspects of difference for intelligibility, even though his argument is based on the difference is actually constitutive in an important way of intelligibility. And I think, getting a more proper dialogue going between this, I'm going to call it my and other people's attempt to revise the Platonic tradition, and the post-Heideggerians like Derrida, who tend to have a very negative view of the Platonic tradition. I think that could be very, very fruitful. I want to mention that the discussion with JP, right? It's deeply influenced, and I've proposed this to JP. It's deeply influenced by John Scotus Erigena, who I consider, Erigena and Nicholas of Cusa for me are.
I just started reading Erigena this week. It's something. Well, have you read Erigena at all?
Not yet.
It's something. It's stunning. That's 9th century, like what he's doing in the 9th century, right, is just absolutely stunning. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing before I forget it. Difference.
Yeah.
Unterschied. That's very similar to when Heidegger talks about the cut, the schism. It's actually that
the schism between being and beings, that there's a schism or a cut.
Yeah, but right, the difference idea is it's the same idea more. It's that's what the translation is of Heidegger's cut. The thing is, right, you could see, right, and that's then like, we don't know how the cut would say participates in the whole thing. Okay, you have, let's say you have, let's use the example from you have my past self and myself now. And they are non-logically identical, related to each other. But there's still a cut going through.
Yeah.
Still, when we talk about this, let's say God, that third kind that informs all intelligibility, and we can't, right? It's very near. We can't see it. We can somehow become aware or mind its presence.
Yeah.
But there's a cut between those.
There's a
there's a cut.
difference
There's a
between.
cut, right? There's a cut between us and cut clicking so negative. There's a difference between us here and that let's say that eternal field of intelligibility, which is God. So right, because how else can you describe it? It's like, it's not like my, like it's not like those there we wouldn't say, oh, that's
Yeah.
there's a true schism.
Yeah.
Still, however, right, we can participate with that field of intelligibility with God. And that's right, that's the whole mystery thing.
Right.
Like how can we then do this? It's not like Heidegger, right? He like I know how to handle like the water bottle. I know how to open it. I know how to pour water into it. I know like the things that are with us in being in the world. Right, we know how to use these things. We learn it quite intuitively and quite quickly, right?
Yeah.
This is this, right? You don't go like this to the camera, you don't slack off. You always find a good way to comport yourself to the situation. We're very good at this, right, as human beings. Still, however, when we talk about this field of intelligibility, which is ontologically different and sometimes schisms through to us, and that there's, right, then that becomes then really a question, like how can we hold ourselves in that wonder that is afforded by that schisming of God into our midst, so to say, if I can talk like that.
Is it similar to say something like, if I had a whiteboard and it was just blank, and I created a schism, right? I drew a line down the center. We could say on what that line does from one perspective is it creates a separation between the two sides, which wasn't there before. But we could also say that it also created a point of connection.
Yeah.
Right. So this schism, and this is where it's like this, is it fair to say that comporting ourselves in this difference, this schism, right, between everything that we're talking about and ourselves, it's whether or not it's a line that separates and creates a forgetfulness of what's on the other side of that line at all, and a profound transforming relationship with that, right, it has to do with the way that we bring ourselves to it, right?
Yeah, and right, I mean, that's that cutting, that's also in a sense, it's like the story of the fall, right? First we were in the kingdom of gods, all living in perfect self-identity, in harmony with each other. And then there's the fall, and then we have to find ways to relate to that God, which we are now separated from. Similar example would be, for example, like what for the child, like you and like for Teak, your son, is dwelling now in perfect self-identity. There's no separation.
Yeah.
There's no inside and outside for him.
Yeah.
That will occur at some point.
Yes. He's had to hire us to create that for him because he can't do it for himself.
What?
He's had to hire us, right, to create that difference for him because he can't do that for himself. That's the holding.
I mean, right? You at some point you're kicked out of paradise.
Yeah.
Now it's like paradise, right? And then you're kicked out of it, and then
That's called the terrible twos, right?
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
And then, right then, I mean, Lacan did these studies, right, with the mirror, and at first you look at the mirror and you don't see or you see your mother, and your mother, okay, there's this perfect self-identity. You're very aware of, okay, these things are interdependent, and so
Yes.
and you're dwelling in that interdependency.
Yes.
Then at someone that comes this cut, this rift, and same thing, right? Is then we could say with God, and right, and that's what John is outlining in the Meaning Crisis series, that cut, that God, so that and that right. That now at the end of this, we can't have a relationship with God any longer.
Right. Huh.
More or less, philosophically speaking,
Right.
like that's gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're just right. There's just the will to will. So we're just wills clashing onto each other.
Yes.
with our with the epistemology that we have.
Right. Right.
And then again, then right, the question is always, how can we participate with that moreness?
Yes. Which is, in some sense, that relationship that's now gone, right, is opening up a new look. Something's flashing to us that we're all, in some sense, converging around in these conversations of not how do we go back to that, because basically that's impossible, right? But in what way is the look of what something like God pointed to, in what way is it still addressing us, even if it's addressing us in its withdrawal from us? In seeing that, right?
The withdrawal is important, because right, for Heidegger, that was one thing that we could actually notice.
Yeah.
That we could actually, okay, things are actually withdrawing their sense and withholding their sense from us.
Yeah.
That is actually one thing, right? We could notice.
Yeah.
And we could hold ourselves in that withdrawal.
Right. And notice that as it withdrawal, it leaves some trace that we can pick up on, right?
Yeah.
And start to where that withdrawal becomes an actual, the way in which it becomes present in a very new way. Right.
I mean, it's not a withdrawal of something.
Yeah.
This is almost a withdrawal of that third kind, right? That has informed our intelligibility, but now that's going away and leaving us in this this desert of nihilism
that no one notices. Yes.
That no one, right? But what is this from Nietzsche, right? The desert grows, but not right.
Yes.
But we are not, right? We're not seeing it.
Right. Right. All right. So let's go back.
Guy, how long do you want to talk? I just want to ask. Well, because we scheduled for 2 hours.
Oh yeah. I could keep going until like noon my time, if we need to. Do you have any time limits?
Yeah, I would maybe like to end in like 30-40 minutes.
Okay. Fantastic.
Let's keep on a little bit longer.
Yes. Daniel and his limitations. All right, hang on.
the culmination of the Socratic tradition. It's so interesting, that when, by the time you get to Nicholas of Cusa, his great insight is learned ignorance, which is exactly where we start with Socrates. It's this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful explication. And so Erigina's notion of God is inherently dialectical, dialogical. And I think this is part of, and this is the part that's unclear to me, Daniel, but I'm groping. This is part of what's going on when Plato is trying to talk about the inherent goodness, right? That right. So the forms don't form. They don't form an. They're not isolated, right? And it's not only that there's an eidetic eduction of everything singular, there's an eidetic eduction of everything plural, right? And so Erigina is trying to get the emanation and the emergence, right, to explicate all of that, but also to get us to disclose, which is of course a fundamental Christian tenet, but it's also converges with the Platonic tenet, that there's something inherently good about being, that it's not a moral goodness or an aesthetic goodness or an ethical goodness. And the reason I'm saying all of this is the wonder. Like there's an inherent wonder in this, because and this is Harman's point too, but it's a Platonic point. I cannot, right? I have to use this fundamental, I don't know what to call it, ontological machinery of myself, right, in order to really get what this is, really get what this object is. It's like, here's what you can hear, I'm stumbling. And Schindler tries to make, there's this argument too, that this deep kinship between my eidos and the eidoses, or the eidai, I don't know what the plural would be, right? That there's a fundamental goodness there. And the way I try to practice that is, right, the way in which my awareness can be for itself, for its own sake, and my life can be for itself in its own sake, and my love can be for itself in its own, that for its own sake, that seems so fundamental to my sense of my realness and my unquestioned, it can become egocentric, but my unquestioned goodness of being. And then I realized, but that is not centered in me. The kinship means that it's actually dependent on the way all of reality, this is Schindler's argument, has that feature to it. And so I cannot make any, there's no good grounds for privileging that within me. But there are some good grounds for actually privileging it without me. And so that for me is my attempt to get at this idea of the good as the eidos of the eidos. And you see me struggling. And I did a recent video with Greg Enriquez and Zachary Stein, where we were criticizing the is-ought distinction and the arguments around the is-ought fallacy, and trying to articulate this more primordial sense of goodness. To me, why that's important, and I really see Nishitani and Nishida trying to do this. I really do. For me, I think that is part of the fundamental way of responding to nihilism, is to get, and to not, as you said, not to state it, but to wonder and ponder and participate in that goodness.
Let's maybe stop there.
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe just let's recapitulate.
Yeah.
So he says, maybe use the example from circling before, because I think it fits well. So you come to circling, you practice it, and then at some point you say, oh, that's circling.
Yeah.
That's the eidos of circling. That's how it shall be.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the is-ought is then also, right? Then we don't have to talk about but then you, right, with that look of things, there comes a certain, right, and the wonder makes you want to aspire towards it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, right, then the important thing is, right, then now, but I don't just see the realness, let's say, of circling, but there's also the reflection back that I see the realness of myself.
Yes. Yes.
Suddenly, right, that's then this thing, right? What I said, maybe let's say tea ceremony, where there was this woman, right, kind of like felt she was seen for the first time. Now she could say, okay, that's how a tea ceremony, and white people then maybe says that's how it should be.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, she's also seen for the first time, and she comes into conformity with her own idols, with herself, for her own sake.
Right.
And that's right. That parenting is also right. It's I mean, you don't just do parenting for your son, but you also come into your own self.
Right.
You also come closer to your divine double,
Yes.
let's say,
Yes.
by that. That means there is this, right, what John said, right? There's this deep transjectivity in those practices when we disclose the look of something else.
Yes.
And then there's also this disclosure of the look of myself.
Yes.
But that transjectivity, that transjective relationship cannot be reduced to any of those points, but only to the third kind, which is then again something like God. I mean, he brought up Erugena and or the ontological good, the goodness of being.
Yeah.
Which has then be described as God.
Yeah. So walk this through and give this a shot. So if we put this in terms of what it is to face another, right? Now the mirror, right, is this anomaly in history that's really kind of almost disastrous in some regards, right? Because we look in the mirror and we think, that's me, but that's actually not you. That's you as you look to another. But what that shows is the way that others give me a face, right? That right now, like, you could say my subjectivity of, in that sense, my subjectivity of Daniel is your objectivity, right? And your subjectivity of Guy is my objectivity, right? That there's this way that, and Ponte kind of goes into this as well, that at a primordial, pre-reflective level, the world is always the face of the world. And that in some sense, the world, and this is where we start to get into this, how do we make sense that how come the eidos doesn't really show itself as the eidos until human beings are around, basically, right? Does that mean, getting all these, big kind of paradoxical kind of questions that that in some sense, the human being is the way, you could say, who is it that said this? Like the world gets its front on the back of my skull, right? On the front of the back of my skull. Like in some sense, that's how the world sees its front is on the back of my skull in some sense. So there's this kind of,
that was Thomas.
Yes. And you get this sense of this reversibility to things, right? This way that I'm, perception itself is when I see the tree outside, right? We can ask ourselves, well, how do I see the tree? I see the tree with the tree, right? The seeing of the tree and the seeing of the tree and the tree itself, I see it with the tree, right? In the sense that there's this deep interpenetration, which I think he's talking about, right? That that I think what he's talking about in terms of the response to nihilism, right, is one in which if we can do justice to, see, wonder about, participate in this way, this uncanny, like barely conceivable, miraculous thing, right, called being in the world, is to participate in the good, right? And then there's this other part too, where and you see this in the dialogues, right, a lot, in the Platonic dialogues a lot, where you get to these where Socrates will take a conversation into this aporia, like you get the limits of talking about the good, and then you get to this point where Socrates is like, I can't say anything more about the good. It's unknowable in this way. It can't be said as he, and this is the way to read the dialogues, because then you notice that Socrates starts enacting the good. He starts being the good, right? Enacting it in the way that he's relating, right? And that's why it's a dialogue in so many respects, is because you start to get to this ineffable sense, right? That you bring up to the limits of that ineffability, and then the way that you know it is by being it, right? In some sense. And I can feel that, like, in these conversations. This is what's so enlivening about these dialogues, and in some sense the reverence that I was feeling, right? This kind of sense of wonder. You can hear it. You can hear it in John when he's talking to you. He's like, yes, that, and that. There's this animation that starts to go on, right, where it's not just the propositions that are being spoken, but in some sense, the propositions are an expression of something much more fundamentally primary going on, which is identification with, in some sense, the good that's weaving all of this together, right?
Yeah, and right then, I mean, that's right. I mean, and that can be very healing, right? That the locus of my self-identity is not just here. It's also maybe, right, not just somewhere else, because that would then be just dependency or so, or right. But it's actually, right, is in this ineffable no thing, which is God. And so my home, right, my home is then in God. And Nicholas of Cusa has, right, the God as the coincidence of opposites, right? And all things, no matter how contradictory, no matter how much they conflict with each other, no matter right how much their oppositions are in tension, they all find their rest and their home in God. It's like the infinite wellspring of all finite things, of all finite existences also. And but then again, right, then we that's why the negative theology is so important, I think, because we always have the temptation to say, oh, this is that, and this is this, and but that's right. That's we can't know that third kind by propositional knowing, but just by practicing, and just by, right, all the things we are doing in the world.
I think there's another way that kind of exemplifies this, or gets at the phenomena of what we are, and why is it that it's something about the human being and our way of being seems to, as John was talking about, something about my machinery, right? That somehow it can evoke these things to come forward, right? but they like those things as they come forward, they co-exemplify myself and bring me forward, right? This back and forth, right? Another way you can start to get at this too is this experience of when someone dies and you in the experience of grieving their loss, right? Or someone goes away and you're no longer in their life or something, and you experience this profound grief. We have to ask ourselves, what exactly is the loss? Is the loss this entity, right, that's walking, that once walked around in the world with, you know, with all these aspects that we can identify? I don't think that that's the core of it. When you're in grief, what you actually lose is the world that that person disclosed. There's a world that comes with Daniel. There's a style, there's a way that, like, being with Daniel, the world discloses in ways that's different than Mary, right? There's things that gather and come together in ways of perceptions and places that I experience myself in the way that Daniel whirls, right? That is what the loss is, right? It's not the entity, Daniel, if Daniel were to die or go away, it's what Daniel is, which is a world disclosure, right? And in some sense, we are indebted. I know I am. I look back in my life and I think about all the people that have just deeply, deeply influenced me, right? What that means that they influenced me is that there's something about the way they were with me that had the world disclosed uniquely in ways in which I could then see and in some sense make my own and then relate to, right? So there's this kind of way where, and I think this starts to get at this sense in which I know it's, so I think a lot of people relate to this. In the beginning of my life, right, as a young adult, I recall, I've talked about this before, there was such a pressure to be someone, right? I just always had felt this deep fucking pressure. In fact, I had a friend of mine take me out to coffee when I was like 17, and he sat me down and he's like, "Guy, do you realize you don't have to be a big deal?" Right? And he was trying to kind of ease this drive in this pressure that I felt. I had no idea what the fuck he was talking about because I was so identified with it, like this pressure to be someone. But it was more about the sense of, like, the drive was more about the sense of this entity that is Guy needed to make something of himself, right? And I've noticed second half of my life, this this drive, right? I'm sure there's a lot of biological things to that, whatever, right? There's this sense in which, like, that self dog has finally stopped humping my leg all the time. And there's more of this sense of that being someone occurs as so much work, right? Like, and there's less and less motivation to do that. But what is opening up is more of this sense of where it feels like to be myself is actually to be a worthy clearing for the world, if you will, right? If there's a drivenness, it's to evoke out the sunset and see if I can not let the sunset fall anonymous, right? Is like the world around me, it's pregnant, it's pregnant in it in some sense to educe what the world is pregnant with, right? So it's got this more of this sense where it's like I feel as I've gotten older, just a sense in which it's more important for me to be nothing than something. And I think this is what this is getting at. In some sense, this is the, like, grappling with these things is a tutoring of that sense, right? It's a tutoring of our attention to be able to start to reconceive our world, right, in terms of this, right, in some deep, profound way.
I mean, what you just described is similar maybe to what Nishitani says in his book, right? That we make ourselves into a nothingness. We empty ourselves kenotically, so to speak, and then right, then things in the world right, they become friendly to us. We befriend reality. We befriend everything with that by letting go of the chain or the container of just our identity. Right, it is also right, this, which is then right, this strive to become someone. And right, and I mean, what you describe, right, is I would argue is a religious existence. Not so concerned, I'm not so concerned just about myself, what's going on here, but I'm concerned about reality, the world. And I make myself also a field for that, so to say, that worlding can happen in the first place.
It's almost a kind of it's a different kind of ethic almost.
Yeah, I mean, at Pierre Hadot, I think in his, I've read a little bit, like one book of his, he says, right, that the way, let's say, worldly people go about with their life, and then let's say the men of wisdom, of religion, how they organize their life, how they move forward in life, those things are almost in opposition to each other. In fact, they have always been in intention, in historically speaking, that right, people who are rather concerned with what would use the right power, status, becoming someone, wealth, and so forth. And then let's say the way some Jesus or Socrates, right? Those guys that don't have anything for themselves, but somehow become this place that others become themselves.
Yes, that's it. Being a place, right? That's great. That's the sense. Yes.
That is right. It's very. I think it's very different to reconcile those things, and that's why that's also the reason why we then talk about things like metanoia also. So right, a radical conversion takes place.
Yeah.
It's right. Yeah. It's right. Those modes of being in the world are not really, cannot be reconciled, but are rather like stages in a process or in a development, right? And that is also outlined in Nishitani, right? When you do this thing, right, you try to make something of you, and then you see, oh no, there's non-existence. Like the ground is all. Right. I could die tomorrow. Yes. We could all die tomorrow. Then when that realization happens, then the conversion, the metanoia happens, and then right, and then you often have those transformations. I don't know, where sometimes business people then become monks or religious people, and then cultivate a strong faith. So Pierre Hadot in his book, he kind of says, I think, that they are like the men of wisdom and the men of let's say the world, the state, or so business people, like they are kind of like at odds with each other.
Yeah, totally. God, that, this brings up all kinds of thoughts I don't even want to go into, but I think about I don't hear much of this spoken about, but just to touch on it a little bit, this forgetfulness of being, right? This, apparently this time, as Heidegger would talk about it, right? That we really, really, really do not recognize that kind of wisdom. We don't see it. We don't even deny it. We just don't even account for that it's there. And I think one of the ways it shows up is our relationship with the elderly, right? Like in some sense, we no longer expect wisdom from the elderly, therefore they don't even expect it from themselves, right? So it really puts them in this odd place where like they end up moving to Florida and these kind of simulacrum. This place in Florida, this town in Florida that apparently has the highest amount of venereal diseases concentrated in the world. And it's a retirement community. It's literally built from scratch. They recreated a town square and they all go there and they act like kids, basically. Right? There's something really cool about the fun part of it, but you can feel that there's, like, in some sense, there is no, our sense of wisdom, right, which used to at some point be implicit in elders, right, like that came with that. They were expected. That was expected of you, right? In some sense, there are roles and traditions around that, and all of that's gone. Pretty much all of that's gone, and I think that exemplifies this place where the eidos is withdrawing, right? You can see the outline of its withdrawal in that particular circumstance, right?
I mean, I mean, sometimes, right, there are these, also elderly, no, not elderly, but often people over the age of 50 are treated, let's say, in the job market, job centers, right? Especially the lower educated, like with having like really no intrinsic worth.
Yeah.
So that's this kind of like, it's kind of like we're in this age of, I really hope this will not be our future, that we have kind of like a new age of serfdom, where just people are today enslaved in a sense, when you think about, right, miners in Africa, or right, the people who, right, I mean, just for the production of a smartphone you need so many parts, and so many, right, those rare metals.
Yeah.
And it's just hard to get them, right? So like a lot of people suffer just for this whole machinery, this wheelwork that we are building.
Yeah.
And
all that to say, just to highlight, in the question that we're in is, what are the conditions that make that possible? I think what we're saying is that what we're addressing in this conversation is that it's this loss of the sense of the eidetic, right? It's the loss of, or the withdrawal of being, right? That in some sense affords these particular aspects that are unfolding in our world. That's what we're highlighting, right?
So, right, let's say sagely existences were able to show and deduce is maybe the best word, that more aspect, the truth of each and anything.
Yes.
Whether this is, let's say, with other persons, maybe in the case of Jesus Christ, but really Taoing them, personing them. Also, right, the case of let's say, animals, or just, right, or artists, right? And so that's right, that's the point, for example, David Bentley Hart makes. We should not think that just humanity is saved, but that underlying the Christian vision is a cosmological redemption. That means the cosmos is redeemed. It means that the sage is able to educe the cosmos, the totality, the whole of beings, not just any particular being, but like, and that's why, right, then then we have a cosmological vision, and then artists also have their place, because you can say, okay, I'm a shoemaker, but I'm so good at that, right? And I have this little space in the cosmos, and then like the other guys, I don't know, is a painter, and the other person is a musician, and the other person is sewing clothes, so and by becoming skillful artists, we can deduce, let's say, particular
Yes.
regions of the world,
That's great.
which are also connected in this way that we outlined before, right?
That's
Like
great.
this is not exhausted in my relationship, let's say, to my craft, but there's this through line going through all these things.
Yes. Yes. And those roles and those customs and those different places and roles are places that echo what we can then overhear as this third something, right? We can begin to hear this third something, right? It shines through.
It dwells in all of these things. And
Yeah.
again, that this Taoing is ultimately cosmological.
Yeah.
So it's not restricted to this person making is cosmological.
Yeah.
Like it's all beings,
Yes.
all animals, all things, all beings, like it's all included in that.
Yeah. Yeah. This is great, Daniel.
Yeah, it was.
We got through maybe 5 minutes of that video. So we'll have to pick it up again.
Yeah, let's do it. I would be very happy to do.
Me
so.
too. Me too, my friend. So good speaking with you, to say the least.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you for inviting me again.
All right. Bye, Dana.
Bye-bye.